Welcome to episode 2 of Testing America's Freedom. Today we'll be talking about school funding, that thorny, complicated issue that has tremendous effects on education equity and on the lives of students and their families long after they left our K-12 schools. I will never forget the first day I walked into my school as a newly appointed principal. It was August 2009, and it was hot in Tucson, Arizona. Hot and humid because that's monsoon season in the Southwest, the time of year when torrential storms come out of nowhere, when that infamous dry heat isn't dry at all, and the fire department has to issue public service announcements warning people not to drive on flooded roads, no matter how shallow the water may seem. In retrospect, it seems like those monsoons were a warning, a sign of the troubling challenges awaiting me inside that school. Not long after I arrived that first day, I paid a visit to the main office. I stood speechless, stunned by the sight of Macs and a filing cabinet filled with floppy disk drives. Yes, your mind's eye conjured up the right image. Those boxy, drab-colored Macs from the 1980s. That was just the first glaring thing I saw. As I continued to walk through the halls of the school, things only seemed to get worse. I noticed outdated curriculum and books that did not represent the school community, which was predominantly Mexican American. Parts of the building had been renovated, but the work hadn't been completed, leaving no hallway or covered pathway between the two structures, and an onslaught of trailers housing primary-age students met me behind the buildings. I took mental inventory of the needs of the school. I processed the emotions of my harsh reality, the wake-up call that I was no longer at the well-funded elite Magnet IB school in the exclusive South Tampa in Florida I had once called home. As I continued to walk the halls and interact with the teachers, I learned the school was just beginning its application for Title I because more than 90% of its students qualified for free and reduced lunch. I had previously worked at a Title I school as an assistant principal, but this was the first time I would be leading a Title I school, particularly during the application process. It was undeniably clear. I was no longer at a well-funded elite magnet school where district, community, and family dollars flowed freely. I had to get creative and fast about bringing in new partners to invest in the school. I had to think strategically and critically about how to use every single dollar that came in. The district was already facing a 20% budget reduction, which meant that my 700-student school would not have a full-time assistant principal, guidance counselor, or school psychologist. Being in the middle of the Great Recession didn't help. The challenges were mounting, and the school year hadn't even begun. Many people assume that all schools are the same, like I once did. But my time in Tucson and 20 years in education has taught me otherwise. I've had the opportunity to travel to various communities and schools, so I know that it's not until you get to know the individuals who comprise different communities, navigate the halls of neighborhood schools nestled deep within those communities, and speak with educators invested in the lives and teaching of their students, that you really begin to notice the both subtle and blatant discrepancies that occur in public schools. The quality of school facilities, curriculum, classroom equipment, technology, and even teachers varies greatly across the country. The root of these discrepancies is always that 5-letter word: money. Funding differences impact the overall quality of public education, altering the outcomes and life trajectories of many students, particularly those of color, for generations. Educational outcomes are deeply tied to generational wealth, power, and influence. In this episode, we'll take a journey through the history of school funding, outline how the cycle of disparity impacts generations, and discuss how we can reinvent the use of public dollars to support all schools. My guests today are Jason Willis, Area Director of Strategic Resource Planning and Implementation at WestEd, and Dan Thatcher, Director of Education Programs at the National Conference of State Legislators. Thank you to my guests, Jason and Dan. Both of you are known experts in your field of school finance, engaging at the national and state level around issues and policies around school funding. Jason, the first question is for you. This history of school finance is a complex one. What are some of the key historical pieces you think our listeners should know?
Thanks so much, Aaliyah, and a real great appreciation for being here today with Dan to talk about this topic. It's something that both myself and the organization I work with, WestEd, has been studying for quite some time, and the history is important. I think it, in many ways, kind of lays the groundwork for understanding many of the dynamics that we're currently experiencing in American public education today. And while it's got a lot of twists and turns, I probably would point to three kind of major events, and then basically an evolution in the way that we've thought about school financing to really outline some of the major issues around how we funded public schools in the United States. I think the first one actually goes all the way back to the founding of the country, in which many of our founding fathers often recounted on why it was so important that our citizens had kind of honorable, ethical opportunities to really be knowledgeable citizens, and that education, their ability to engage in a democratic society, to participate, to vote, to share their voice, was so important to a healthy democracy, because it raised both their ability to contribute and to participate actively as a part of the government, but also ensure that their perspective and the resources that they felt like they needed to thrive were being well represented by their elected officials. It wasn't shortly after that Horace Mann, who eventually became the Secretary of Education in the state of Massachusetts, was one of the first individuals to kind of claim this idea of the common school, which prior to that, if you can believe it, was a very fractured system in the United States in the mid-1800s. And I think, importantly, one of the things that he really declared is that the common school kind of safely affirmed the ability of our citizenry to be most effective in driving those good citizen democratic participation and societal well-being assets. And one of the things he quotes, it's stuck with me for quite a while, is that as, quote, a Republican form of government without the intelligence in the people on a vast scale, it would be nothing more than a single superintendent or keeper keeping a government together and moving forward. And so I think he really kind of set out the design of what we see today in public schools. And I think even through the 1800s and up to the Brown v. Board decision in the mid-1900s, there were not a lot of conversations about how resources are being used, or concepts of how much resources are being used or where they were going for what kinds of students were not well understood. And I think Brown v. Board really changed a lot of that. It really brought to the forefront and really kind of set a tone for the country in stating that racial segregation in our public schools was unconstitutional, that keeping Black and white students apart created vast resource disparities in our schools and our school districts. And that was, in that way, the spotlight that our country needed to understand these differences, not just in those moments where students had access to those resources, but I think, as we're going to talk about a little bit later, the kind of intergenerational challenges that begin to basically amass across generations to create bigger and bigger gaps between these students. And so it was after Brown v. Board, the feds began taking pretty dramatic action to flow resources, including federal funds, into schools that needed it the most. Title I, which is the hallmark of our Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, still stands today as being one of the most progressive funding laws ever passed in the country. And to that end, I think really kind of sparked a debate starting in the 1980s, in which we had a lot of court challenges that really confronted this question of school funding. And that was, I think, what started into this discussion about how best to think about distribution of funding at both the local and the state level, in a means to help all students achieve some either opportunity of access, which was kind of the early arguments around equal access to resources, but what has now evolved into discussions around adequacy. And with the dawn of kind of common standards, we now had a benchmark to understand how and what resources students needed to achieve those standards. And so that has been, I would say, the most recent set of pages in the history of school finance in our country. And I think confronted with, the particularly aggressive economic swings that we've seen over the course of the last 15 or 20 years, I think it's beginning to highlight even further challenges and disparities that we've seen in funding. And it was a result of that trend of those court cases that significantly shifted the reliance of funding for public education away from localities onto states. And I think that's been a really good thing. We've got some research evidence to suggest that that has resulted in more equitable funding systems in the country, but there's other unintended consequences of that that I think are tied to some of the economic realities that we've been experiencing over the last 15 years. But in a nutshell, without having to go through a full semester of coursework, that's how we might describe school funding and finance in America.
Thank you so much, Jason. And it's interesting to me. You talked about the role of the state and the possibility of the state role. So with that, I want to actually transition to Dan. Dan, your work has included topics around governance, redlining, policy levers. Building off of the history that Jason just mentioned, can you unpack some of the biggest challenges education leaders and our policymakers face when addressing the funding inequities, knowing that state budgets are fixed, they're tight, there's not just an abundance of funds. So how would you help our listeners understand kind of what those big challenges are?
Yes, thank you, Aaliyah, and thank you for inviting the National Conference of State Legislatures and myself to this conversation. It's an important conversation, particularly right now, given all the pressures that are on our education system and the pressures that the pandemic has placed on our economy. Our state economies, our local economies are dependent on a robust economy, and when things go south, so do the finances for our public schools. And I'd like to allude to something that Jason had mentioned, which were some of the decisions that the Supreme Court of the United States had made during this history of education in the United States. And one of them is a decision from 1973 called the San Antonio v. Rodriguez decision. And this was a decision that found that education is not a right guaranteed in our federal Constitution. So unlike a lot of other state constitutions that have a right to education written into their constitutions, really stemming back from Horace Mann and the importance of having an engaged and educated public citizenry to make our democracies robust. This decision found that our federal constitution, the same one that has the Bill of Rights, the 14th Amendment, the amendment banning slavery, found that there's no right in that constitution to an education. Justice Powell, who wrote that decision, in his very last sentence of his majority opinion, said, "The ultimate solutions must come from lawmakers and from the democratic pressures of those who elect them." So I think the answer to some of this is that what legislatures are dealing with have to be guided in part by our own sense of community among ourselves, and not whether we think of ourselves as a neighborhood, a city, a state. What is our community? And the pressures that come to the state legislatures, who must vote and come up with a budget, they are at really the pressures of being reelected. And they're reelected by us. So I don't really think of this issue as being at the hands of a few bad actors or not, but it's our issue as a society, as Americans, to grapple with the inequities. We're the ones who elect our legislators, and that's why it's so important to get out and vote. So, I had this great mentor when I was an intern in the Utah legislature. And when I went there, he said, Dan Jones is his name. He was the kind of the bygone godfather of Utah politics. He said, when you go to the legislature to look at individual legislatures, and he suggested to be three things. One would be their constituents and their constituents' concerns. The second, their party and their whatever political party they belong to, and the third would be their ideology, the political ideology. And it was clear when I got there that everyone was driven by their constituent concerns. And if that wasn't a concern, if they were in a safe seat, then it would be a party or their own political ideology. But all this to say that as legislatures are grappling with declines in their own revenue, and whether to enact a tax increase or whether to take from one pot of the state budget to another, they are responding to those democratic pressures to elect them, i.e. us. And so I think this is important too, to explain that most of the money that comes into our education systems comes from either the state or local governments, and that the federal government is right now, somewhere between 8 to 12%, depending on which state you're in, of the revenues that come from the federal government to our public education systems, and the rest comes from local and state resources. So, when we're talking about the ultimate solutions, as Justice Powell mentioned, we really need to think about what the state policies are and how they direct revenues, whether they come from the local level or the state level.
Thank you, Dan. So both of you have mentioned the role of the federal government, the role of the government at the state level, and also the local level. You have also both mentioned Brown versus Board of Education and the importance and significance of that ruling across the nation. Jason, this question is for you. You and I had an opportunity to meet Minnie Jean Brown Trickey, who was one of the Little Rock Nine, who helped to desegregate Central High School. We talked a lot at that meeting with her about the inequities and the challenges that she faced in 1957 as a 14-year-old teenager. What parallels are you seeing now in the wake of COVID, or with just the realities of COVID, that would parallel to some of the inequities that we talked about with Minnie Jean 2 years ago, but also that happened 50-something years ago?
Yeah, thanks, Aaliyah, for that question. I think it's a really good one, and I think in particular there's a couple of very clear parallels for me as I think about her reflection on her time as one of the Little Rock Nine and how this pandemic has impacted the very structure of schooling and how resources are assigned to support our students. And I think the first one really goes back to that notion that Horace Mann had about the common school. His idea that obviously had swept across the country and kind of lays the foundation for what we commonly understand as a public school experience. What all three of us went through when we were kids, of going to school on a day-to-day basis and being in a classroom with other kids. And some of those kids looked like us, some of them did not, but being able to have access to an education and learn about things from English to math to history and science. And I really do feel like the pandemic in some ways has deconstructed that notion of the common school. From a public health perspective, we're doing what is necessary, as a nation, and what we individually feel is the right thing to do to stay healthy, which is obviously of even greater concern in some ways than getting a public education. But I think what that has done in large part has siloed us in our kind of private residences and our private families and groups that we tend to grow up with. That has really deconstructed this idea of common school. And so, what we might have thought about before as being an opportunity to leverage resources into a single school building or into a single school district to support all of those students and differentiate those resources, I think we're seeing a pretty dramatic backward slide as a result of that. One example that comes to mind, and this is, I think, a pretty critical one, is that many people don't really think about this, but school districts, in some form and fashion, operate as mini cities, right? They provide facilities for kids, they provide meals for kids, transportation, not to mention good, high quality instruction, social emotional learning, mental health, and behavioral supports when necessary. And there was a recent statistic, anecdotal at this point, but the proportion of meals that are being provided to students that qualify for a free reduced price lunch are dramatically lower this year than they were in the past. So you have to wonder, what happens to those students when they're unable to get breakfast in the morning, or they're unable to get access to lunch in the afternoon? What does that say about their educational experience as compared to other students that don't have to worry about that? That's something that their parents or other family members can provide. So I think that's the first really big one, is that I think the pandemic in some ways has kind of deconstructed that notion of the common school in ways that I think we're still really trying to understand. I think the second is really understanding the difference between equal versus equitable. And I think in that way, again, this is a common example that's come up over the course of the past 5 or 6 months, but with this reversion back to distance learning as a result of the pandemic, we've really had to think about what is the technology infrastructure that students have access to in order to just gain access to the opportunity to learn. Like, we're not even talking about getting that accelerated course of work, or getting that extra help from a teacher, or that access to a mental health counselor in a school. We're just talking about the basics, like get me online, get me access through an internet portal, get me access to the software. And I think it's important to remember that that is just equal, right? That is just making sure that all kids get onto the same playing field without the consideration of what else are those students going to need in order to jump over hurdles that they're going to face on a day-to-day basis, in their home. And with the prospect of being in a situation where many students, millions of kids across the country, are going to be at home learning for potentially the majority of this school year, it's important to think about that distinction and consider how actors at every level, the state, the school district, the school level, including folks like myself that work in support agencies to that system, can really push the conversation about ensuring we're using resources to create equitable access and opportunity for those kids. I think the last, and like very much in the inverse of that last example I gave, is that I think it's really highlighted how severe some of these gaps really are, and what education was doing up until this pandemic struck to really kind of push back against really what would otherwise be the individual choices of family members, guardians, parents, for their kids. And that's not to say that that's not important, right? If you're an individual parent and you have kids at home, you're going to make the decision in the best interest of your child. And we should do that. But living in a society and having a democratically led society creates that opportunity to wanting to think about how full society could benefit. And I think in that way, we've really been confronted by, both one, what public education was doing for our system before the pandemic, and now confronted with a lot of challenges of how do we figure out new ways to navigate inequities that are growing as a result of the pandemic.
Jason, when you mentioned the technology piece, I've had an opportunity to chat with at least half a dozen governor's offices in the last 4 to 6 weeks. And as I share with them themes that I'm hearing from superintendents across the nation, educators across the nation, that access to technology is a big one. There was one particular day we had, it was a Friday morning, I won't forget, because I had two really important meetings that morning, and my calls are technically video calls, and we lost our Wi Fi. And so now the two meetings that I was supposed to be leading, one of them with in my role as a fellow to the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard, I couldn't run. And the anxiety level, the stress level that I felt, knowing that I didn't have Wi-Fi and my cell phone carrier wasn't strong enough to be able to do the video call. So I think about, from a social emotional learning perspective, the impact of the lack of access and awareness for kids who know they're missing something, what that does to them. To also, to your point on not even having access, forget it being equitable, just the access piece. I want to turn it to Dan and ask you, across the legislators that you work with across the US, what has the conversation been around this technology gap and what the implications are, not only in the short run, but for the long run for this COVID class?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. This is, I think, could fall into a couple of buckets. One is we've been hearing from legislators that they, more than any other time, have been fielding numerous requests from their constituents. That their constituents are concerned. They're being very vocal right now, and they have less time to devote to their own what has traditionally been their own professional development time, to voting up on policy and whatnot. And they are overwhelmed with constituent questions, emails, calls. And these calls are really about from what we've heard, this technological divide. And it spans Republicans and Democrats, rural and urban areas. So the first bucket is that we've been hearing that there is a divide, and going back to this notion that there's democratic pressures that drive these legislators. I think they're being very in tune to these conversations, and we're seeing states introduce legislation that would try to bridge some of these technological divides, whether it be broadband or providing access to Chromebooks, computers, et cetera, to households that otherwise wouldn't have access to them. And I highlight one scenario that Senator Gary Stanislawski in Oklahoma told me recently about a program in Tulsa that a grant program that was able to put broadband in places in the city that didn't have it before, and also direct Chromebooks, the digital media that's needed to households that didn't have it before. So this is definitely on the radar of legislators in a way it's never has before. The second bucket is this rethinking of education. And to this, I point to Senator Wellman in Washington. She's the chair of the Senate Education Committee there. She recently told me that education is no longer a space, but an experience. And that this may change the way that we even think about and deliver education. And subsequently, Senator Stanislawski in Oklahoma said the same thing to me, that with relying on technological infrastructures and virtual learning, remote learning, et cetera, perhaps we're going to have a rethinking of education, which has implications for equity. But it's something that legislators at the state level are having to contend with and will contend with for the next legislative session, and I imagine a few legislative sessions beyond, with this kind of new reality that we have, and this experience that teachers and parents and students have had. That this is really a paradigm shift, one of those moments where things may change, for better or worse, but we're hoping that it's going to be for the better.
I really appreciate you bringing up the future of education. This is actually something that I've thought about quite a bit, and the idea of this podcast was really given birth out of a conversation that I had about reimagining education. And I want to kind of set the stage. The conversation I was having was with a superintendent, and we were talking about just the sheer cost, operating cost of numerous school buildings, some that could be over capacity, some under capacity, and everything in between. And really thinking about what if there was more flexibility in the dollars that districts receive to be able to think about not getting back to normal, but identifying what the new normal is. And as she and I were having this very hypothetical conversation, it is one that has stayed with me. I have two young sons that are in public school, and one of them who I would not be surprised if he decides he doesn't want to go back to traditional school ever, that this is going to be his education environment. And I thought to myself, what if we really started to challenge how we use school funding dollars? For example, what if kids could, and kids whose parents select it because it's best for the child and the family, recognizing that model's not, it doesn't work for everyone, but what if there was a model where kids who wanted to go to the building could, those who wanted to stay remote or in a virtual type of setting could, but that we really start to think about the community supports, the after school programs, those providers, to then reimagine what the school experience could be. Rather than a school bus picking up the kids to take them to school, what if there's 2 days a week that it's field trip day or nature's classroom or whatever, and they're picked up from home and then they can go to this other setting to be able to, have those social interactions, to be able to see their teacher in person, but they're still remote to a degree. And so I'm curious from both of your lenses, when we talk about school finance, as we reimagine education, what flexibilities need to be in place as we reimagine the education system, and what changes would you like to see or recommend for the future of education? Recognizing, Jason, to your point, the school buildings and school as we grew up knowing it likely won't exist anymore. So how should we be thinking about this?
Yeah, I wanted to. Yeah, no, it's such a big question, but I think a really good one in this moment when, we do have an opportunity to really rethink a lot of the, our traditional norms around delivery of public education. And I think in that way, it really kind of builds on one of Dan's points as he was recounting some of his interaction with some of the legislators and how they are thinking about this redesign and that opportunity that's kind of presented, that it's an experience, not a space. And I think that opens up all kinds of different doors that we haven't necessarily had the opportunity or had to rethink in the past. And I think driven by some very clear principles around, what does high quality instruction and delivery look like in that new dimension? What does access to that look like? And, importantly, how do you think about, still a distribution of resources that is equitable based on the needs of the student? So while you might even change the mode or delivery, the needs of those students are still going to be presented. So figuring out ways to ensure that they're getting access to, those opportunities, they have, the ability to access those courses or those high quality teachers are all still really important things. So I think for me, it starts with kind of establishing those principles and then understanding what we do know about what really drives good and more rapid student achievement, especially for struggling populations. And so considering things like the way that you would allocate resources for school buildings. This is a less discussed topic in public school finance, but the way that we construct school buildings, the way that we pay for those buildings is through local taxpayer bonds. So we basically, a community will take out a huge loan, essentially, to construct a building that would support generations of kids in the future. And so as we rethink the modes and the delivery systems, maybe you only need a third of that capacity. And so the size of that loan, the size of that interest that is, being paid by that community on that building potentially is significantly less. That begins to, I think, get into a discussion about, this question that many taxpayers ask about, I'm paying this money, right? It's going to the schools, it's going to the state. What am I getting in return for it, right? And how are they seeing those differences? I think that another place, we touched on this quite a bit, was around technology and access to technology. I think, technology has been like an amazing innovation for society over the last 20 and 30 years. It's accelerated at tremendous pace. But in that way, it's kind of neutral, right? That like the values and the morality of the way you use it and the way you think about using it relative to the population you're trying to support and help is critical. So again, I go back to the kind of principles. I think the last place that we really have to have a conversation is about, all the professionals in the system. They are often like represented collectively by a bargaining contract. And I think that creates an opportunity to ensure protections for, employees, especially our classified units that are often the parents in our communities with kids in our schools. And those things are really important. And, this conversation about now the opportunity to rethink the system has to include their thinking and their perception about how best to serve those students in a way that I think really balances exactly what Dan was saying before, the reality of the amount of available resources. I don't think there will ever be a moment in public education where we're going to say we have enough funding. Like I always think we're going to be in a situation where we have a limited set of resources because we're competing for a limited set of resources with lots of other public service. So thinking about how we best make the use of those dollars that we do have to really support kids and to support broader society and their growth and development seems like the ways in which I would frame out the way to go about these kind of conversations.
Thank you. So you mentioned about how school funds are essentially based off of property taxes and dollars and funded from communities. And we hear time and time again about the importance of wealth and understanding how wealth impacts the gaps to quality, to access. So as we continue to hear this discussion around the importance of wealth, can you explain to our listeners who might not be as finance gurus like both of you are, explain how that wealth gap and that achievement gap are connected or certainly feed into each other? And Dan, maybe you can kick us off, and Jason, if you have additional comments, I would love to hear from both of you.
Well, yeah, sure. I can start, and I think Jason can definitely elaborate on what I may say. And by the way, the ed finance community is a pretty small group of people, and I have this running baseball card collection of ed finance experts, and I've got this like all-star group of cards, and Jason's the all-star pitcher in this scenario. I really admire those who go into this policy area because it's really complicated, and there's few that really have that, I don't know, nerdiness to do it or a backbone to do it. I don't know what it is, but I admire
nerdiness. I like nerdiness.
Yeah. Well, and Dan, I will tell you, when I was running the education division at the National Governors Association, we had just launched our new strategic plan. And we as a team had to get smarter on school funding to support governors' offices and their education advisors. And we know education funding touches every part of the continuum. And so when I met Jason that day at a Education Commission of the States meeting, I was like, we need your brain, because it is such a deeply complex issue that there is a sense of finance literacy that you have to have. And I can tell you, even after all the tutoring that Jason has done with me, I am still probably like a B- student in this area. So I'm totally with you. And the reason why it was so important to, after our intro to this podcast, start with school finance and school funding is because it is the foundation for every other part of the discussion around education. And so we really wanted our listeners to have that at least most basic knowledge of school funding and why it matters, so that we can continue to build on the equity discussion.
Yeah, that's great background for one of the ideas that I'd like to share with people when I talk about education finance. And the first of that is that voting matters. It's not just the political, the excitement that comes around a presidential election, but when it comes to how funds are distributed, we can calculate that about 80% of all funding in a state follows the statutory system that allocates funds across the state. So legislators are making, on average, about making decisions that allocates about 80% of all funds in our education system. And so this stems to how much funds a local government can raise for public schools, the tax policy that's decided at the state level and what funds they rely on, and that mix of state and local funds. So again, just to reiterate, when we look at on average around the United States, about 10% of funding, 8 to 12%, depending on the state, comes from the federal government. And then right now there's about parity across states of what funding comes from the state versus the local level. And then if you look at states, there's kind of a spectrum where some states really rely heavily on state revenue. And on the other end, some states rely a lot on local revenue. And whether these states are equitable in their funding or not is kind of a mixed bag. But the issue that is really relevant to this discussion and looking to the future of funding for schools and funding for learning is just kind of even that notion, we're funding schools and districts at a statutory level right now. We're not really funding learning as we go through our state statutes. And when I talk about state statutes, these are the laws and the texts that state legislatures write and that local governments have to abide by. So I want to stress the value of state legislatures in this context, and that when those who are listening to this are thinking about voting, you must vote for your state legislature if you care about education funding. I just want to reiterate that because they are the ones writing the laws that distribute at least 80% of this funding. But the reality of COVID-19 and this pandemic and our remote learning experience is really blowing up our model, in that we've funded school districts and they've been based on jurisdictional topography in some cases, on the ground boundaries. There's vestiges of racism and redlining in how we've drawn these boundaries, but it's not just district boundaries. Even within a school district, the way the school boundaries have been demarcated and assigned are also based upon really our geographical identities and where we live. And again, a history of redlining and in some neighborhoods of the covenants that homebuyers have had to buy onto. And I come from living in the very neighborhood that was litigated in the Keys case, the U.S. Supreme Court decided, that found that Denver's drawing of school lines in our neighborhood I live now was de facto segregation. And so the question now is, are we transcending some of these jurisdictional, topographical, geographical boundaries to think about the delivery of an education where it's not the space, but the experience. And is this an opportunity for us to think about building in some equity that's not confined with our own thinking of geographical and spatial realities of our school funding systems? And this is kind of maybe like 5 years into the future, but that's kind of where I'm hearing some legislators think about this, and where others were kind of thinking about this moving forward.
I really appreciate that. I as a parent of young children, many of my friends were all in the same age bracket where we are taking care of children, whether they're young or teenagers, but then also keeping an eye on taking care of our parents and what that future could look like. And it's been interesting to really start to see the paradigm shift of, well, my kids are going to be okay, to wait a minute, my kids are going to be adults with the rest of these kids. So I should also care about what their experience is, what their quality of life is, because ultimately they will all be coexisting in the same, if not community, in the same town, in the same state, making up the same workforce. And so the empowerment of all benefits my children and those children as well. I think about my county actually has an initiative called One Fairfax, where it looks at the county as a whole and how to ensure equitable resources so that the county flourishes, not just pockets that do very well. So I appreciate that, and also the call out to voting, and really the importance of making sure that your belief and what you value comes out in the polls to make sure that we have key decision makers, regardless of party, that reflect the things that you think are important, such as education. So thank you for that.
And Aaliyah, can I just add to that too, because I want to stress this notion that you just mentioned, that from my own experience and that research has also, I think, confirmed, is that this isn't a party issue, that there's Republicans and Democrats alike that are working on constructing state laws that make the system more equitable. That I've really found in my experience working with Republicans and Democrats, this is not a partisan issue. This is just an issue from those who are propelled from their own experiences and sense of community. And I just want to reiterate that.
Yeah, I agree. And Jason, I'll turn it over to you. One of the best lessons that came out of my time at the National Governors Association is really being able to intimately work with individuals on both sides of the aisle. And there are certain issues like education that absolutely cross party lines. And there's phenomenal leadership, which we'll get to that in one of our final questions about the importance of leadership. And there's amazing examples of leadership in this space across party lines. So thank you. Jason, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I just to underline that point as well. I mean, I think that this doesn't really have that kind of partisan association with it. I think that any state, any circumstance, you're going to find students that have needs, and it could be an inner city community of low-income students. It could be a very rural, impoverished community in a part of a state. And I think that collectively we've seen this emerge over the probably the last decade or 2 decades, where states have been trending in this way of envisioning their funding formulas in a way that recognizes the allocation of those resources. I think it's been backed by a fair amount of strong research that says that that kind of additional resource allocation for those students can help to propel them forward. And that's each of those states are making those individual choices based on their circumstances, but that is certainly a trend that we've seen across the nation over the last several decades. I wanted to go back to this notion of kind of wealth disparities, and in particular how thinking about a service like public education can contribute to that growing disparity. And obviously it's not the sole factor. The way that we construct markets, the way that we think about our ability to accelerate and prosper in the United States is a fundamental belief of our democratic society. And it's a reason why we've had so many people come to this country kind of seeking that opportunity. And that's great. And it's done amazing things for tens of millions of families. But I think one of the things to recognize, particularly as we've become a much more kind of global capitalist society, is that the disparities in wealth have grown. So one of the statistical ways to show this is to look at the difference between some of your lowest wealth and highest wealth families in the United States. So imagine lining up every family in the United States from those that were the least wealthy to those that were the highest wealth. And 100 years ago, the difference between those two, between your lower wealth and your higher wealth communities, was probably on an order of magnitude of say 5x, right? You fast forward 50 years, that has grown to 10x, and you fast forward to basically where we are today, or about 5 or 10 years ago, and that has ballooned to nearly 25x in terms of those differences. So the analogy that I would give to you, and I think this begins to bring in the severe economic swings that we've been experiencing over the last 15 or 20 years, is if you can imagine, you had a set of families, two families that had to cross the ocean, right? And if one of those families started out in a kind of outboard motor with 4 people in that motor, and another one of those families started out in, a boat that, maybe had an inboard motor, was a little bit faster, right? That was like 100 years ago, right? And 50 years ago, the difference between that was that same kind of small dinghy of a boat and an outboard motor. But today, that boat for the most wealthy is basically a yacht that can go at 5 or 10 times the speed of another. So as they're crossing the ocean to try to get to the other side, think about like the size of the waves as being basically your upswings and downswings of economic activity in the country. And you could imagine the struggles that, in both of those cases that they might experience in trying to reach the other side of the ocean as a result of that. And the very kind of practical realities and some of the very difficult decisions that I think families, particularly ones that are not as wealthy, that do not have as much access to resources, are facing, are very real. Today, you may have families with younger kids that are in childcare. Their work, based on kind of where their station was as a result of their education, requires them to go to work, right? And they have to make a choice of basically putting their child in daycare, at a place where there could be some risk for the virus, versus, going to work to earn a wage to make sure they can put food and keep a roof over the head of their family. And that kind of choice is not the choice that many other Americans are experiencing. And so in that way, our experience of the pandemic is dramatically different. But that wealth disparity is in part seeded by many of the things that Dan was talking about, that access to a high quality teacher, right? To opportunity as you move up to middle and high school, a chance to get into a post-secondary degree to earn a college degree, are the avenues that allow people to get access to higher amounts of income and higher amounts of wealth that allow them to feel more secure in raising their own families. And that's this notion of intergenerational wealth and change that is so critical for us to think about, and in part to really hold up opportunities for making sure many of our low wealth families and students that are struggling are getting access to those opportunities. So you can imagine that, over 5, 6, 10, 15 generations, if you are stuck in that avenue, right, without an ability to climb the ladder into different income brackets, as you're experiencing an economic downturn, or as you're even trying to recover, like your ability to get access to those resources are likely to be severely diminished as compared to other populations. And I think that is what we have to confront, as states, as a country, in thinking about how best to construct policies, particularly around the funding of schools, that allow students to get access to those opportunities, that allow them to make those intergenerational moves, both to their economic and societal benefit.
Amen. Jason, you have a way of outlining things in such a simple form where it's easily digestible. And I really appreciate that analogy of the boats because really right now, for some people, this pandemic feels like an ocean that's going to capsize their boat at any given moment. And so finding ways to support the families it is definitely critical. So we're coming close to the end of our time. And Dan, I'm right there with the nerdiness where I could talk about this all day, but we are close to our time. And, we all of us have, in some degree or another, uh, can say we serve in a role of a policy influencer, helping to provide resources, research, support, ideas, recommendations. But as we talk about the long haul game of this, because we realize, the COVID recovery, it's going to take some time. And we have kiddos that, mine included, that are going to be in this COVID class where we're going to be watching the impact of them for a couple years to come. What is one thing that you would encourage a policymaker to do? And what's one thing, and I know it's going to be hard, but just one that you would like us as individual citizens to do to be able to really start to address some of these, to address the school funding, school finance, wealth gap, opportunity gap? What's something we can do moving forward?
Okay, I can jump in first, I suppose, because one of the easy answers for me is that at NCSL, we don't provide policy prescriptions. We try to support legislators in thinking, as they think about their own policy solutions, we give them the research and that can help them think through the way they're thinking about these solutions. But there's one thing I could say that is not necessarily prescriptive, and that is that it's so important as legislators, as policymakers, as decision makers, whether you're on the local level or the state level, that as you're looking at the communities that have had the least resources given to them, and you're thinking about giving them more resources, not to be paternalistic or prescriptive with those resources, but you have to do community engagement. And it's so hard to do this well. Community engagement is very difficult, but the solutions aren't going to come from your own mind, from a policymaker's mind, but those on the ground who don't have resources know what they need. Those on the ground who are trying to get their kids online and into their to log on to their online schooling, whatever it may be, they know what they need at that moment. Don't tell them what they need. They know what they need. And when supporting these communities and giving them more resources, make sure that these communities use those resources as they need, not as they're being prescribed. So that's kind of one admonition I feel comfortable providing in this context. I am just really, this experience as a father, and I know all of us have school-aged children, has really eaten me up, because my wife and I, who's a physician here in Denver and works at Denver Public Health and has been on the front lines of the pandemic from the very beginning and saw Denver Health's first COVID-19 patient. And the fact that we have two boys, they're twins in second grade here, and seeing how we're trying to help them through their learning, and I'm trying to do it while working, and my wife can't be here in the house because she's working on the front lines of the pandemic. And I feel like we still have opportunities that most families in Denver don't have. And if we're struggling, I really heartfeltly can't imagine what other families in our city, in our community, are struggling with that don't have the same resources we have. Those families who are essential workers, who have to be at their positions so that we can all kind of function as a society and as an economy, while their own children are trying to log on to their online school, are trying to navigate this craziness of remote learning. And my hope is that all of us, whether we're in Denver, Colorado, Kansas, California, Maryland, Virginia, wherever we're at, can start thinking of ourselves and our plight and our own condition as a condition not just for our neighborhood, but as a community extending beyond our own arms, our own walls, and our own neighborhood boundaries. And so that's my hope too for the school finance systems, that we can start making them at a state level more cognizant of our boundaries and bringing resources to bear where they're needed, not prescriptively, but so that local communities can take advantage of those resources and put them where they're most needed.
Thank you, Dan. Jason?
I think Dan laid these out really well. I probably kind of close a closed caption here, but I think important to underscore a couple of the points that Dan mentioned. I think the first of which is, so WestEd, the organization that I work with, is a nonpartisan research technical assistance organization. We've been in this work of supporting education institutions for over 50 years. And one of the things that we pride ourselves in pursuing, creating access for these populations, pursuing equity in our systems, is really listening and understanding and being able to discern what the evidence and research says about what is best for, both all of our students in American public education, but, particularly those that are struggling. And I think that's really the first thing that I would say to our listeners, that it's important to really be discerning about that evidence. When you are an American, it comes with both a tremendous opportunity, freedom, an ability to kind of make your own decisions, but it's also a burden of being an informed and engaged citizen, and using your voice to help elect leaders, I think, exactly to Dan's point, that are going to make choices that propel the full society forward, and not to the benefit of a few select individuals. I mean, I think that's the heart of it. So I think what comes along with that, is being able to discern that evidence and research, and voting for those that are going to step into elected office and listen to that, importantly, in balance with, listening to their stakeholders that elected them, to make wise choices on the benefit of the collective, not the benefit of the few. The last thing that I would say is really thinking about, as a listener, how we get through these very difficult situations. If it's an economic recession, it's a public health crisis, it could be any number of things. And part of me, truly does believe, and where we've seen some real benefit in, at the state level or at the local level, the opportunity to compel really good public policy to the benefit of a community, is thinking more broadly about listening and thinking about and enacting a tone of a conversation that is one that is trying to get to a solution and not breaking down the institutions that we've created. And I think that, certainly I've come to appreciate over, my professional time in public education, the importance of that foundation of a democracy and the opportunities that it's created for kids, and our ability to make choices that ultimately create a better society for everyone, including our most struggling students. And so, I think highlighting and underscoring what Dan said, in addition to those, just got to do a couple of those small things, and we're well on our way, right?
Yeah. Well, as we come to a close, I first want to really thank you for your time. We all are balancing school-age children, we're working full time, and then to just take something like this on. But I will say my hope for this podcast, particularly as we talk about the policy piece, is to make it digestible for so many people who feel like policy is the black box on a plane. We know it's super important and holds critical information, but we don't know how it works or how to crack the code to it. And so my hope is to really be able to highlight the inequities in education that we know are there. And at a time when policy is changing and moving left and right, being able to stop the pendulum from swinging so dramatically and really think intentionally on how we could support the needs of all students, because we really are better as a collective. So thank you so much for your time. We will be sharing some of the resources and publications that you both have been putting out, because we know our listeners are going to want more information. And so thank you again for your time and your great work.